Hello, welcome back to the Socialist Shelf with me, Jacob, here with Joss.
How's it going?
And today we are talking about H.P. Lovecraft, The Mountains of Madness. And I think we're both pretty excited for this episode. It's definitely a hard turn from the last few that we did, but trying to vary it up, trying to do a whole variety of things, a whole smorgasbord, as it were.
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily. Oh, let's not mince words. This is not a dystopia, and I wouldn't call it as bleak as Brave New World, just because of the sheer fantastical kind of nature of this. I mean, it is bleak, but just in a different way. It's further removed from your human experience. Point is, I'm very excited about this one. It's a change of pace, and it's something that I've been really anxious to discuss, that I don't get to discuss enough.
Yeah, and I believe you'd read this before. I had not. This was my first time reading Mountains of Madness. I'd read a little bit of Lovecraft before, just the basic stories, Color Out of Space and Cthulhu and all that. But this was my first time reading any of his longer works, and it's definitely interesting, and it definitely bears examination. So yeah, Joss, if you want to give us, we like to talk about the author, the context, and what they're writing in, try and ground things. So if you want to give us some background on Lovecraft as a guy, I know he's a complicated figure, take us away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it starts in Providence, Rhode Island. He was born there August 20th, 1890. Yep, as all stories do. All roads lead to Providence. Certainly in his life, they eventually did. So he was born there 20th August 1890. When he was 3 years old, he had a lot of family issues growing up. When he was 3 years old, his father was institutionalized, and 5 years later, he would die of complications relating to, as it happens, late stage syphilis. So he loses that figure in his life fairly early. Other than that, he has a fairly affluent kind of a bourgeois upbringing in his family estates. He lives with his mother. He lives with his aunts. He lives with his grandparents all on his mother's side. And his mother, Susie, always kept him nearby, never let him out of her sight. And their standard of living basically rested on the business dealings of his grandfather. And his grandfather was a man named Whipple Van Buren Phillips.
Solid name.
Maybe it's I mean, you can kind of get a picture in your head of what this guy looks like just from hearing it. But if you look him up, he is every bit the late 1900s businessman. And yeah, he was major landowner in Rhode Island. He was a constant formative presence even while he was on his business trips. He frequently wrote to young Howard Phillips while he was away, and from a very early age, Lovecraft was actually reading and writing by the time that he was 3, which I tend to view as less an innate sort of thing, and more he was surrounded by literature. He was surrounded by knowledge, and had the opportunity to engage with this sort of stuff from a very young age.
Yeah, absolutely.
And engage with it, he did. He was raised on classic poetry, literature, what's called weird fiction, which until Lovecraft came along, it wasn't really as codified of a genre as it is now, rather. It was a term broadly used to describe supernatural fiction from at least the 1850s onward. Poe was a big figure in this field. Sir Walter Scott wrote in it. Bram Stoker, of course. Dracula was described as weird fiction in its day. He was familiar with The 1001 Nights, the work of Gustave Doré. So his formative years included lots of the fantastical, the macabre. And he started writing when he was about 7 years old. And if you go to hplovecraft.com, you can actually find stuff from when he was 7, 9, that's managed to survive. It's adorable. At 13, he did what all 13-year-olds do and started publishing his own journal of astronomy. He was very, very interested in the sciences, and he published his observations, his what he was learning, what he was seeing in the skies. And he did this actually through the age of 19. And it's good that he had something to keep him occupied, because in 1904, when he was 14, his grandfather's business concerns fail for good. The stress kills him, and Lovecraft and his mother ultimately end up not being able to afford their family estate. They move into a smaller duplex. He starts high school. He's a good student. He made friends, but chronic health issues keep him from going to college. In 1908, he drops out for good.
He's a real sickly guy, right?
A real sickly guy. Yeah, he grew up with a variety of health problems, and that kind of partially informed his worldview. There's a fear of weaknesses in like his bloodline and his ancestry cropping up and basically taking him out of the game. And you can see that in certain of his works.
Not to like derail you too much, but it is interesting. You basically in none of his works see this all-conquering character that can, you very rarely see a heroic character that conquers by his own will or conquers by his own body. The character is almost always just absolutely scared and out of his mind and completely over challenged. And you can kind of see like where that perspective comes from.
Yeah. And you'll notice as well, like all of his characters are he's written many self-inserts in his career. Lovecraft has, you got Randolph Carter, you got the protagonist of At the Mountains of Madness that we're reading, and they're all invariably scholars, invariably people who dig too greedily and too deep in terms of things they're not supposed to know.
Yep.
So he starts writing his first proper stories shortly after not graduating high school, including The Alchemist, which he ultimately published in 1916. That was his first short story. Unintentionally, by the way, one of his funniest. I recommend you go look it up. It's wild. He lives with his mother, who funds his publishing, his self-study of science, particularly organic chemistry. He loved science. He hated math. It actually gave him debilitating headaches. Mood. And then his first published poem now came in 1912, and it's called Providence in 2000 AD. And this is where we get into the part of H.P. Lovecraft that everybody knows really well. He was an insane, incredible bigot. So this first poem of his, you can look it up. It's basically this nativist fable where his self-insert character returns to Providence and Americans have been displaced. It's completely overrun with immigrants. It's especially in his earlier work. It's not. There's very little artistic value in it. It's bigotry wall to wall, and it's not until later in his early career to the mid career that he really starts writing about things that are more universal in terms of what's scary, that has appeal beyond scared white dudes who never left the house.
Right.
And I don't want to dig too deeply into this, but so the previous year he'd started writing into pulp and weird fiction magazines, letters to the editor, engaging in literary criticism. He joins the United Amateur Press Association in 1914 when he's 24. And what an amateur press association basically is a collection of amateur journalists and fictional content from associated writers. Everybody associated would make a bunch of zines and write a bunch of articles, send them in, and then it would be collated and sent back around. So that same year that he joins, he's appointed chairman of their Department of Public Criticism because he wrote extensively into literary magazines to discuss and criticize and debate writing. So he's appointed chairman of their department of this, and in this capacity, he loudly and racistly criticized what he saw as the bastardization and the decline of the English language, for which, of course, he blamed immigrants. He reserved his greatest ire for African Americans. He wrote some truly reprehensible poetry. His early lit crit short stories, again, as I said, they reflect his worst prejudices. He was a huge Anglophile, and he was the sort of racist who believed that white Anglo-Saxon English culture was like the pinnacle. Like he believed if you were Swedish, you were inferior. If you were Southern European, of course, it didn't count as white. He didn't even have kind words for French Canadians. It's bizarre.
Yeah, reading on him, it reminds me a lot of the I don't know if you've watched Community, the TV show. Mm-hmm. Pierce Hawthorne's dad, when he comes on the show, and he's racist against literally everyone who's not like the very specific Scottish or whatever. Like
Yeah.
he looks at a Welsh person and he says, "Why, you're practically a Swede." That's basically H.P. Lovecraft. Like, it's advanced racism.
That's literally what it is. And that's what and that's the thing, you know, because I see it's funny, whenever you look up H.P. Lovecraft on the internet, like if you type in H.P. Lovecraft into Google, one of the first things that comes up is H.P. Lovecraft cat. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into the specifics of it. Everybody knows Lovecraft had a cat with a racist name.
Mm.
But, you know, it wasn't uncommon at the time, though it was certainly considered off color to call small black things, you know, a certain racial slur that we'll not name. But the fact that people use, you know, and certainly, of course, H.P. Lovecraft deserves to be tarred with that brush, you know, because he brought it on himself.
Yeah.
But I want to make it clear, because there's so much more to H.P. Lovecraft's racism than just, you know, the obvious memes of the day. Because, again, he used his platform for you know, he used his platform to loudly denounce what he saw as, you know, the corruption of American, like, British descended culture. You know, he trafficked in some of the worst stereotypes of the time. So, you know, if somebody says, well, you know, he was just a product of his time, you know, you can't really buy that, you know, because if he were on Twitter today, he would be posting some truly reprehensible stuff, you know, and he'd have
stuff. Yeah,
exactly, you know, and he'd have a platform, he'd have an authority, you know, he was one of the big names trafficking in this stuff. So, you know, just want to make that clear. Now, he tries to join World War One. He tries to join the army and fight in World War One because he believes America should protect her mother country, England. So, kind of cringe. He passes the physical, but his mother pulls out all the stops to keep him from going. So instead of the timeline where H.P. Lovecraft went off and fought and maybe died in the trench, he started going to writers' talks and conventions. He met some of his closest friends and biggest idols. And right at the start of this time, his mother was committed to Butler Hospital in 1919, same as her husband. We don't know why. We never will, specifically because her records were destroyed in a fire. And in 1920,
that's Lovecraftian right there.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it's the sort of thing that you might see in Lovecraft Country. Have you seen that?
No, I have not.
Highly recommend it. And I'll bring up other stuff as we discuss Lovecraft.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that comes from his work and from his space that he wrote in, and manages to transcend him. You know, he is a titanic influence on American horror, both because of what he wrote and also in spite of himself, you know, because people have spun off his work into some truly intriguing and intellectually challenging spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's Lovecraftian is obviously a term that's grown out of itself, you know, from like Stephen King, Junji Ito, Guillermo del Toro, like off the top of my head, just like different types of like artists that we find that are popular in like different things, like have pulled from him. He's undeniably impactful. And I mean, it's just like worth noting that like, you know, not everyone we're going to talk about on this show is a good person. We're not necessarily even going to like all the work of everyone we write on the show. I mean, I do think this work on its own merits is pretty good. But that's like neither here nor there. Like it happened, so it's worth engaging with, you know, because it's part of our history. And then, you know, for better or for worse, like that's a thing we have to grapple with as we sort of understand the structure and superstructure of our present moment and how we're here and then how we go forward and change things.
Right. And see, I'm glad you brought it up in that context, because I sort of reflexively suggested At the Mountains of Madness when we were starting to dream up a list for this. And it took me a second to really nail down why. And I figured it out just in the past few days as I was finishing up rereading it. Lovecraft, as I said, had a deep and abiding interest in the sciences. You know, he dove into astronomy, geology, all these other fields to figure out how the world works. But he was also an enormous pessimist. You know, he's your classic reactionary who loves science, loves technology to the extent that it explains the present state of things. but he's fundamentally terrified of the idea that those things might have to radically change.
Right.
Right. And so, he's inspired certainly in writing Mountains of Madness by the recent, in his time, Antarctic expedition. Robert Byrd had just finished up his first Antarctic expedition. This was after the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, when people started exploring with planes and radios rather than just going down there with ships and dog sleds. So it was sort of a turning point into this last frontier that was unexplored. So and he certainly had, he certainly found it fascinating. But as we'll see, he also feared the revelations and the forces that such scientific progress would bring upon humanity.
Right. And I mean, he's in what year was this published? 31?
He wrote it in 1931, and it was actually rejected that year by Weird Tales for being too long. It wasn't published until February through April 1936 in Astounding Stories.
But still, the context of that of 31, and you can see the technological forces as they're progressing and as they're creating this new world. The idea of something exciting at first, that then you realize, oh, we've stepped over the brink, almost like a cartoon character who runs out into the air, looks down, realizes there's nothing underneath him, and then falls. That's almost the perspective of, a lot of the Western world in the early 1930s, with the rise of fascism, with these contradictions reaching the fore as, the Great Depression hits, as World War II is rapidly approaching, as these forces of communism and fascism are fighting it out in Europe and elsewhere, as colonialism is coming to a head. It really reflects a lot of the era. And Lovecraft looking to these areas, really two specific areas, the Arctic and just space, where we have not yet grasped, and yet where we are beginning to grasp. And the idea that, we reached just barely too far, we now crossed over. It is very indicative of its time and very indicative of its mindset. Despite what he may or may not have thought that meant.
Exactly. And it plays into his literary philosophy that he developed throughout his life, which was it's called cosmicism. Basically, the idea that there's no discernible divine presence, A, so you don't have that comfort. B, humanity is adrift and insignificant against forces much greater than they. And it's rooted basically in the fear of the unknown, which he termed the oldest and strongest form of fear. There's an essay that he has, supernatural horror in literature, that he wrote. I forget precisely when he wrote it. It was a little after the middle of his life. I highly recommend it. It lays out all his philosophy in a really intriguing way, and you can see you definitely see the impact that it has on the American horror scene going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did Lovecraft's life sort of wrap up?
Well, so it's interesting. So as I said, bigot, white supremacist, anti-Semite of every stripe you can imagine. He meets in July 1921. So I want to back up a little bit. In 1921, he started writing the stories in what's considered the Cthulhu mythos. So his most famous works.
Yeah.
And in 1921, his mother dies. It's devastating to him, but he still, lives independently, works on himself, goes to conventions, speaks with other writers. And he meets in July of that year Sonia Green, the woman he would marry 3 years later. She's 7 years his senior. She comes from a Ukrainian Jewish family. And, even at the time, we have from her, because she lived considerably longer than he did, we have from her writings how she tried to act as kind of a moderating influence on him and on his attitudes. It's, again, Lovecraft is that classic, he's got those classic contradictions of the racist. He will marry a Jewish woman, he will have Jewish friends, and yet still hold these, odious attitudes.
Yeah.
But they try to make the best of it. Ultimately, what splits them up is not so much attitudinal as it is material. They move to Brooklyn. Lovecraft thrives in the company of writers that he meets there, but Sonia's hat-making business fails. She loses everything at a bank failure. Lovecraft tries to support her, but he has a hard time finding work because of his lack of traditional work experience. So she goes out to Cleveland for work. She sends him an allowance and sees him maybe a couple of days out of every month. He moves into a tiny apartment in the neighborhood of Red Hook. He gets robbed and left only with the clothes on his back at one point. He hates it anyway because it's an immigrant neighborhood, and his xenophobia and the misfortunes of this time actually inspired him to write this short story, The Horror at Red Hook. Don't bother with it. I'd highly recommend you read The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. It's a retelling of that story from a black man's perspective. Much more it's much more intriguing and engaging. So he saves up his wife's money eventually. He moves to Brooklyn Heights and then goes back to Providence to live with his aunts in 1926. That's where he lives the rest of his life. That's about the time he starts writing The Call of Cthulhu. His aunts never approved of his marriage, which ended up working out for them because ultimately Lovecraft and Sonia decided it wasn't working out. They divorce. She moves to California in 1933, remarries in 36. And unbeknownst to her, Lovecraft never bothers to sign the divorce papers. We don't know precisely why. So he lives with his aunts till 1933, moves to 66 Prospect Street, where he lives until his death. His last 11 years in Providence see his most prominent work, although he has trouble selling stories, doesn't handle rejection very persistently. Some of his most important, fascinating correspondence takes place at this time. He wrote 100,000 letters in his life.
That's a lot.
Of which about a fifth survive. And these are long letters too. Like these aren't just, your short emails that you send for work. He traveled extensively up and down the East Coast. Actually, I didn't know this. I found this out in the process of my research. The longest single work that he wrote was a travelogue of Quebec.
Huh. How long was it?
I didn't get the exact page count. I was looking for it.
Gotcha.
It's one of the more difficult to find ones. So yeah, he was paid for At the Mountains of Madness $315. In today's money, that's $6,000.
Not bad.
Which is the most he ever received for a story, but it gets savaged by the critics, and that combined with his increasingly fragile health, it basically ends his career. The Haunter of the Dark, which he'd written the previous year, comes out in Weird Tales that December of 36, and then he's done. One of his best friends, Robert E. Howard, had killed himself the previous June. So there's a big physical, psychological toll weighing down on him. And he doesn't go to the doctor to get checked out until February 1937, by which time he's dying irreversibly of intestinal cancer. He keeps a diary of his symptoms, true to his intellectual curiosity, until he's no longer physically capable of writing. And ultimately, he dies March 16th, 1937. He's buried in his family tomb in Swan Point Cemetery. There's a famous headstone of his that says, "I am Providence." That's not where he's buried. It was put there by fans in 1977, but it's a frequent pilgrimage spot. I myself have been there. It's a really pretty area, So yeah, he lived till about 46. So not a very old gentleman at all, and he kind of, we don't really get to see him, mature. Certainly he was an accomplished writer, but we don't really get to see him mature further in his writing or in his attitudes, So it's interesting to imagine what might have been.
Gotcha. Yeah. So he dies. Not a very happy life. Not a very, not very, he got interest in him. People knew who he was. But he didn't live the life of some posh author that was well respected, some life of the mind that he probably would have enjoyed. A lot his romantic stuff came to frustration. He didn't seem like he was an incredibly happy person on most accounts. Obviously, a lot of that he did to himself. So yeah, it's little wonder how that his works could be of stuff that his works are so rarely have any kind of real joy to them or anything like that. Now, they're not bleak in the same way as a dystopia might be bleak. They're more cosmically bleak. They're more man is an ant under a microscope kind of bleak. But you can kind of see how that influenced what he wrote about.
Precisely. Not only certainly his certainly his bigotry informed a big part of it. certainly he read widely among people who believed that Western civilization was like the pinnacle, and then it was like kind of irreversibly declining. There was that element to it. There was that sort of existential, there's something congenital in my bloodline that's going to catch up with me. He found his niches in terms of writing, in terms of his science fiction, in terms of his writers' communities, and he thrived within them for the time that he did. But yeah, ultimately he came to a pretty reclusive end.
But yeah, nevertheless, produced this Cthulhu mythos that has really hung over everything, all the writing world, the sci-fi world for so long. It's a very, even if you don't read any sci-fi at all, you probably have heard Cthulhu. You've probably heard of the concept of Lovecraftian. And this mythos is so many of his short stories sort of intertwine, and they aren't, necessarily episodic or part of one story, but you see it sort of all happening at one time. Well, while one explorer is looking at an island here, another one is in Australia here, another one is reading these works here, another one is seeing this ritual, or one of them's, and then in this book they're in Antarctica finding this ancient city, and it's all sort of coming out at once. You have references to across works, and this got built on as well. I mean, it's been built on significantly. Plenty of people have written Cthulhu books, Cthulhu works, reference things like the Necronomicon. Am I saying that right? Necronomicon?
Necronomicon, that's exactly what it is.
Things like that they've been built. I mean, there's obviously the Call of Cthulhu games and mythos based on that. There's also that sort of thing. So this like sort of shared world, which is only a sort of half mythology, this sort of shadow mythology underlying the quote unquote real world, has sort of grown beyond Lovecraft into this interesting, almost eldritch kind of strange, self-contradictory, often rumored figure. Some of it published, some of it online, some of it whispered at it's this very weird, half understood conceptual thing that like absolutely the Lovecraft mythos really is probably the best example of just what Lovecraft was going for in the first place. He probably would be very delighted to see, the development, at least on a lot of levels.
100%, because that's the element that lets his works transcend, his own limitations in terms of character and in terms of worldview, because he was not shy about his influences. He borrowed elements from Poe, from Lord Dunsany, which was a writer that he looked up to very much. I believe one of his events was one of the first ones that he wrote to that he came to as a young writer. And so he borrowed elements like names, like sounds, like concepts from their work, and he in turn encouraged other writers to play in the worlds that he created. You have C.L. Moore, you have Robert E. Howard, you have a lot of his contemporaries borrowing characters, borrowing names, borrowing locations from each other. And that sort of community was ultimately what that sort of community outlived him, and it continues to this day. There's a in the wake of his death, August Derleth's Arkham House took up the rights to publishing Lovecraft stuff, but it's in the public domain nowadays. Pretty much anybody can do what they want with it, and you get the sense that he would have wanted it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to toot my own horn here too much, but there's another author who pulled from Lovecraft, who I actually I ghost wrote a YA mystery series called The White Fork Chronicles.
Oh, brilliant.
And they pull from Lovecraft here and there. I was like, but they I got basically paid nothing to ghostwrite this series, but they were like, kind of do whatever you want with it. And I'm like, well, I'm writing Lovecraft for kids. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, it wasn't a lot of fun to get paid almost nothing and to see, another name on a book I wrote, but aside from that, but yeah. So I even have that connection to it, even though, like I said, I'm not like a huge Lovecraft guy. I just kind of thought that was amusing, and I was like, hey, this is a thing a lot of people have pulled from.
Yeah.
It's just a sort of a trough people have gone back to. And then other people have done their own sort of counter mythos. I mean, Stephen King sort of has a Lovecraft style mythos that like works through his books. And Stephen King's another author that I haven't actually read a lot of, but I know he has this whole elder gods list and all of that stuff. I mean, and then you have obviously both of us like Hidetaka Miyazaki's Souls games and things like that, which absolutely, especially Bloodborne, pulls from Lovecraft. So I mean,
Oh,
the influence is
yes.
massive.
Yeah, Bloodborne. That's as good of a Lovecraft game as you could find.
Absolutely. So,
Mhm.
we're a little bit in. So let's get into the text now that we've, thoroughly discussed Lovecraft, given the caveats of what we think of him as a guy. And I'm not a believer in separating the art from the artist. I am a believer though, and I can say I like this about a book without endorsing the artist, just to clarify. So when I say I like this in the book, it's not necessarily an endorsement of the guy or what he's writing going into this, but to give you a nuanced perspective on what we're looking at here.
Oh yeah, and I've been there, I've done that, I've gotten the tattoo, and I'll be the first to tell you, yeah, don't waste your time with this story, don't waste your time with that story. Like some of them, some of them are some of quite frankly, some of them are worth reading, some of them are worth not. And the ones that are strongest are the ones where, again, he transcends his own personal bigotries and fears and taps into something more universal, which is the idea that there's big stuff out there that that you just hope doesn't notice you.
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, this book doesn't really have a lot of that the more problematic elements of some
No.
of his other works.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really given a chance to. I mean, obviously one can divine certain things, but yeah. So yeah, it's a first person narrative told by geologist, the fellow's name William Dyer, I believe. And
Yes.
he went on a scientific expedition to Antarctica. And from the beginning of the book, okay, this fella has already gone to Antarctica, he's already come back. And he's been to date very hush hush about what happened on his trip. Which was like much publicized, and people died. They found some new things, and he said, "Hey, up till now I haven't said what happened, but it seems like people are going back to the location I went to, so I'm going to bite the bullet, and I am going to say, here's what happened on my trip. This is going to be very difficult to say." And even while he writes this narrative, he dances around some of the things that happened, and he really has to work hard to get to the point. And he gets even over clinical at moments as this character describes what's happening, and sort of he kind of drags his feet in a lot of places. It can almost get I don't know if annoying is the right word, but it can also be like, all right, Dyer, what did you see?
Oh yeah.
But he's scared, and he's talking like a person who's like getting there, but getting there in his own sweet time, which allows this book to have a very slow burn feel to it.
Yes. And
Yeah.
he's talking about, his character, William Dyer, is a professor of geology from Miskatonic University. And that's a setting that Lovecraft made up. It's this university that's in eastern Massachusetts, and it's the sort of university that has the resources, that has the cash lying around to send 4 professors and a handful of grad students to Antarctica for an expedition. And yeah, as you say, he gets very, very clinical in parts, and Lovecraft really shows his work in terms of stuff he reads about geology and the necessary supplies for an Antarctic expedition. And yeah, absolutely, you get a sense that there is fascination, and there's fascination, and there is genuine knowledge that is valued from this trip, that Dyer values from this trip. They find all this cool stuff that pushes the geologic record back hundreds of millions of years, and it's only in dwelling on this stuff that he really finds the strength to continue.
Yeah, and I just want to note before I forget that the university that William Dyer is from is situated in the fake city of Arkham, which is what Arkham Asylum was named after in the Batman uh, DC Batman universe. I had to look that up, but yeah, that it is. They also named their, Arkham Asylum, home of all Batman villains,
Oh yeah.
after Lovecraft.
Oh yeah.
Just always cropping up everywhere. But yeah, absolutely. They find this mountain range out in the Antarcticas that are higher than the Himalayas. This massive, and they're led by this guy named Professor Lake. And yeah, they find these, you said, like they said, they find this thing that puts the geological record back. They find these prehistoric life forms and these strange specimens of this weird ancient species that is, it's like hard to even picture it when it describes them. But they're like what? Like they're like how far back are they? Like Cambrian age or something like that?
Cambrian, Precambrian, even.
And they're and he ended up just calling them like elder things and old ones, but they're these weird man, I don't even know how to describe them because he takes like a page and a half to do it in the book. But they find a few of them that are frozen that turn out to still be alive, and those things kill like half the party while the rest of the party is away.
Half the party, and not only kill them, but there's evidence of crude dissection. So you get this dynamic where you find these specimens and then they turn it around on you. Now they're the ones who are examining and who are studying the scientists. They themselves, in fact, are scientists out of another time.
Yeah, so Dyer and then Danforth, who's the other real character who shows up in this regularly, and this isn't a very character-driven book. Really, the only character that comes through in this with much character at all is Dyer. But yeah, like they travel across the mountains of madness, as it were, to this ancient city that's on the other side of the mountains, and it's difficult to get across. Their airplane, they have to really like lighten the load to get over there, and they find this just massive city. I mean, like it's most of it's frozen and ancient ice, and it's just this sprawling, huge, unbelievably, the architecture is bizarre and twisted, and it's like them staring at it. They're fascinated by it and they're horrified by it, and it's like nothing humans could have made now, but it must be more ancient than they could have ever believed. And just in this one moment of staring, their entire perspective on everything, which up till now in the novel has just been hinted at with these fossils and this horrible thing that happened to their party. Their entire perspective on what is even possible is completely shattered in this moment.
Yes. And he, several times throughout the text, I honestly stopped counting, he refers to this landscape in the context of it looking like the works of the Russian painter Nicholas Roerich, who was working at the time that Lovecraft was active. And if you just Google Roerich, Roerich, you'll see what he means. It's bleak, stark mountain landscapes, lots of blue and white, not a cloud in the sky, and you just look at it and the temperature in the room drops like 10 degrees.
Yeah.
So yeah, and they find among the mountains, they find these ancient buildings, actually they can only assume by these, well, not they can only assume, they find hieroglyphs and art confirming it, built by these strange elder things that they too had buildings, they too had it's implied clothing at times, they had art, and they had culture of their own. Hundreds of millions of years, almost even billion years before anything human, before anything complex was thought to have evolved on Earth. And the elder things, were in fact not always the only ones there.
Yep, there were also the sort of the Cthulhu folk, the squid people who came from space as well, because all these things came from space. It's hard for them to follow exactly what's going on because they're divining a story from hieroglyphics. They figure out that there was this ancient war between these elder things and between the Cthulhu creatures. They were driven here and there, and they had cities on the land and cities in the sea. And it's hard to tell exactly what happened because they don't exactly know themselves. But and eventually their civilization, for some reason or another, sort of degrades further and further until they get deep into the city. And they even say the quality of the art has kind of degraded. It's still like beautiful, but it lacks like a certain mysticism of the early things. The elder things have lost certain sciences that they once had, certain abilities. Their culture has declined over the tens of millions of years. And eventually, just due to the cooling of the earth and the collapsing of everything, these elder things retreat deep into this subterranean black sea beneath the earth. And with them, they take the Shoggoths, biological entities created to perform any task, assume any form, reflect any thought, that speak with the voices of their masters. Just these truly weird, bizarre, freakish creatures that are really the Shoggoth is the real main horror of the novel.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and it's also suggested briefly that the creation of the Shoggoths may have something to do with the creation of at least some life on Earth, which is sort of this one chilling moment that's kind of left unaddressed going forward.
Which, yeah, again, what sleeps in the genetic code, what horrible things are can you find if you dig back enough.
Right, exactly. And Lovecraft is a staunch atheist. So this sort of suggestion of where did humanity come from for him, lacks this religious element, and he's able to, turn the creation story on its head. He's able to turn it into this sort of nightmarish thing of like, what if we are some byproduct of some dark thing, and we're now this insect walking on the hull of a universe that we're just now beginning to put our finger into the waters of and realize just how small and insignificant and truly cursed we are, is kind of his mindset on this.
Yeah, dwarfed by this previous civilization that quite possibly created us as an accident or as a curiosity, as Everest indeed was dwarfed by the mountains that they find.
Yes, and it suggested, interestingly enough, that there's another mountain range in the distance of this one. That's worth noting. They don't see it, but you're talking about dwarfing things. It suggested that there's even another mountain range, if they could see through the mist, that's even higher, and a plains that are even more dangerous, a place that's even more horrible. And that the elder things were afraid of. That there are things in this world that the elder things fear, like not just the Cthulhu's, but some old cursed god that is sort of whispered about. That Danforth may or may not see at the end, that drives him truly and fully mad. But so it's all like a Russian nesting doll of horrors. And the real scary thing about Lovecraft is that you don't really know what's going on, and you never really will, no matter how intelligent the character is, no matter how clinical they are in their analysis, no matter what they do. To discover more is for things to get worse.
That was part 1 of At the Mountains of Madness. Come back next week to listen to part 2. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you like us, rate us if you can, and follow us on social media at Socialist Shelf. And we'll see you next time.